Okay. Hi, Carlton. How are you?
Hey Douglas, fine. How about yourself?
Doing great. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you here. You are a photographer for National Geographic, yeah?
Yes.
This must be National Geographic Week because I just had somebody on yesterday who is a writer for National Geographic for the last 20 years or so. So
Oh
we
wow.
we seem
Who
to
is
be
that?
David Quammen. Do you know him?
I do know David Quammen. Yeah, he's done some amazing work.
So we had a nice conversation, talked about his travels around the world and working with Jane Goodall, who is certainly a legend. So it must be Happy National Geographic Week.
National Geographic Conservation Week too, because he's been a big, large landscape conservation advocate, and one of his stories on the mega transect where they traveled a couple thousand miles through Africa and inspired 13 national parks was part of the inspiration for the work I do in Florida.
So how did you get involved with National Geographic? I mean, that's like one of those dream jobs that everybody wants. How did you get that?
I first started my relationship with National Geographic Society as a grantee. So in 2011, I got a grant for the first Florida Wildlife Corridor expedition that I led in 2012. It was a 1,000-mile trek from the Everglades to Georgia to show that we still have a wildlife corridor in the state of Florida that we can protect. And I had funding from several other grants, kind of from the conservation side, before I got my first storytelling grant for the PATH of the Panther project. And then my first feature story for National Geographic magazine wasn't until April of 2021 when the Florida Panther story was featured at the same time that the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act was being introduced to the Florida legislature. So that was a big moment for me, both on the dream job, publishing a feature in National Geographic, and then using that National Geographic to help inspire lawmakers about a piece of legislation that's saving land here in Florida.
So are you doing the writing as well as the photography?
I do a lot of writing, but in this particular story, we worked with a writer on staff named Douglas Main, who wrote the Panther story.
So we're going to be talking about the book, and the book is called Path of the Panther. Now, this is specifically just about the Florida Panther, not the ice hockey team.
No, but they're having a pretty good path this year so far. Maybe they'll make it to the Stanley Cup.
How did you get specifically involved with the Panther?
No, I mean, I'm not even a wildlife photographer necessarily, but I am a conservation photographer focused on doing my part in inspiring the protection of wild places. And that work has been focused on Florida for more than 15 years now. I founded a project in 2010 called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It was based on existing science, but it was trying to bring a story to the need to protect a connected network of conservation lands through Florida. We have 10 million acres of public lands, but they were becoming islands surrounded by development, and that's not good. So we need to keep green space, protect farms and ranches and other compatible lands so that we have connected green space in the state of Florida. That was what brought me into the Panther story. I'd been photographing Florida's cattle ranches and other kind of wild places that are hidden in plain sight and not part of our mainstream identity. That led me to the story of Florida black bears. It led me to the idea of this wildlife corridor narrative. And the more I learned about the Florida panther, our state animal, and the fact that they're only living at the southern tip of the state, but cannot recover or reach sustainable numbers unless they have access to historic territory further north throughout the peninsula and even beyond into the rest of the southeast, it became evident this was a great ambassador for telling the wildlife corridor story.
I think a lot of people would be surprised that there would be big cats in Florida. You don't think of it. You think of alligators and you think of snakes and a lot of swampland, which you wouldn't think big cats would thrive in that type of an environment.
Exactly. And that's one of my goals is to help people see these lands in different ways. Panthers did survive in the swamps, not because they wanted to, not because it was the best ideal habitat, but it's the last place we gave them. The panther is basically a mountain lion or a cougar. They're all pumas. The panther is the last remnant population of puma surviving in the eastern United States. They've been wiped out of existence everywhere else this side of the Mississippi River, except for this little group of 20 or fewer that survived deep in the Everglades, deep in the swamps, because that was the last place that people wanted to be. And they were able to eke out an existence into the 1960s and 70s when a conservation ethic was starting to take hold across America and throughout the world. And the Florida panther is one of the first species on the Endangered Species Act in 1973. 50 years later, they've recovered to nearly 200. There's been a lot of habitat protection, and now they're perched on the brink of a potential recovery if we can get them access to more land. So that's kind of how it all comes together for me. That the panther is a window on how to save wild Florida.
Well, I'm curious how you go about actually saving an endangered species without taking them all into captivity. You have to leave them in the wild, and how do you keep people from, I assume that they were taken to almost extinction through hunting and poaching, right?
Hunting, poaching, there are actually bounties on them sanctioned by the states to get rid of them because they were perceived as threats to livestock and other livelihoods. And so they were systematically removed from land in the eastern United States. And, they don't need us to take them into captivity to survive. They need us to give them space and give them habitat to survive. And they're doing quite well in the places where they have enough land. And that's the challenge now, and that's the opportunity. If we can save enough land for the panther to recover and expand in its numbers, we'll ultimately be saving enough land to keep a balance for people and wildlife in this state.
Have they been tagged and tracked?
There is selective tagging and tracking that happens. Some really great research by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They'll use GPS or radio tracking collars, but of 200 panthers, there's probably only collars on fewer than 10 at any given time. So it just paints a picture of the way they move, how much land they need. They've learned that a single male panther has a home range of 200 square miles. That's 4 times the size of Miami. So it's another reason why they make such a good ambassador for protecting large connected green space, because you virtually can't provide habitat for a panther by just saving one state park or one state forest. You need to have all those things working together with the adjacent cattle ranch and the adjacent citrus grove to have enough green space for a wide-ranging animal like this.
There's a question on your bio here. I'm just going to read it. How do you find a compromise between the seemingly opposing issues of preservation for wild animal habitats and the pressure for human development?
Great question. I'm not anti-development, nor is the Florida Wildlife Corridor Project. What we want to do is steer development away from the most sensitive areas and closer to existing urban cores. Because there's nothing that says we have to have suburban sprawl to provide the needs of people. In fact, suburban sprawl ends up putting a big strain on society in a lot of ways. So the more we can improve our urban cores, build our suburbs tight to the different cities, and the more we can preserve agricultural lands and working lands and green space, the better it's going to be for wildlife and for people into the future.
You've probably seen some of these videos on YouTube, and I think most of them are in the outskirts of Los Angeles, but where an enormous amount of bears and big cats have been coming into human habitats, more than usual. And people have been blaming climate change. People have been blaming just the population expanding. How do you keep the two separate without putting up huge fences and barriers? Because obviously people don't particularly want panthers running around in their backyard.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, do we need to keep them separate? That's a question. I think for an animal like the black bear, the best thing you can do is not put your trash out till the morning before and have smart practices that don't draw these animals out of the woods for an easy meal. When it comes to a predator like a mountain lion or a panther, maybe you don't leave your hobby goats out overnight in your backyard and don't let your dog run free off the leash in woods where panthers live. But you can very well coexist with animals like this. It's just a matter of appreciating and understanding that they're actually there and behaving accordingly. I mean, that said, the more edges we have, the more development we have, the more places you have for conflict. So it's not about building a fence, it's about protecting big, large tracts of green space so that the only edges you have with development are on the outside and not cut all in between like a crazy jigsaw. And then it's about having buffering. So you have the cattle ranch or the citrus grove and other types of lands around your big public lands. So it's more of a transition from urban and suburban out into the wild.
Okay. What do they eat exactly?
They'll eat meat, basically
Meat.
anything that is meat. But the main food, the preferred food that they've evolved for is to hunt white-tailed deer or muley deer out in the west. In Florida, they also rely on the feral hogs, which are quite abundant. So that's a silver lining for panthers. If you're a cattle rancher worried about losing a calf, that panther will get rid of a lot of your wild hogs and coyotes too, because they eat coyotes. But yeah, white-tailed deer is their historical primary food source.
Do they get along with alligators?
That's a good question. We have, in addition to this book, there's a brand new film that just hit National Geographic through Disney Plus and Hulu called PATH of the Panther that follows my work trying to tell the story across the past 6 years. And there's a camera trap clip with a big old alligator, probably 10 feet, sitting on the side of a trail. And that alligator races off into the swamp. And then seconds later, this female panther comes striding along the trail. And so it was pretty cool to see that that alligator didn't want anything to do with that Florida panther.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I would have guessed that the alligator might wanted to have had that for dinner, but maybe cat just tastes really bad.
Or maybe these panthers are kings and queens of the swamp. I mean, you've seen the footage, I'm sure, from the Pantanal of Brazil where the jaguars feed on caimans as a primary food source. And I've seen tigers, tear apart crocodiles on video in India when they try to compete over food. So, these cats aren't to be messed with.
How long did it take you to put this book together?
The book is about a year in the editing and production, but the photographs inside it, the project started in 2016 and was full-time for about 5 years to get most of the panther and bear and other wildlife pictures within it. And some of the pictures go back to the beginnings of my career earlier in Florida, 10 or 15 years before.
How close were you able to get to the panthers?
That's a good question. See, I mean, as much time have I spent in the Florida woods and forest, I've only ever seen 2 panthers with my own eyes, and only one time with a camera in my hands. So aside from the pictures where I'm working with veterinarians or biologists, the only wild panther picture where I was holding a camera is in the introduction of the book. The rest of the pictures are using something called a camera trap, where I'm taking a professional studio camera or professional camera, mirrorless or DSLR, putting it in a waterproof box, connecting it up to multiple flashes to light the scene, and using a motion detector, typically an infrared tripwire. The animal walks by, triggers the camera and flashes, and takes its own picture. And that's a technique that was essential to try to get any of these pictures, and it's why it took so long. Because the panther would only come down these trails maybe once every month, once every 2 months, only a couple times a year facing the camera with any kind of daylight because it's mostly dark. And so it took literally years to get most of the pictures that are published in the new book.
Is the new book out? Is it out now?
Yes, the book was published in the very beginning of May through National Geographic, and you can get it anywhere books are sold.
Well, Carlton, we got to wind this down. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Very interesting. Last question. Do you have a website you want to give out?
Yes, please go to pathofthepanther.com. That's a great place to learn more about the project, see the book, get links to the film on Nat Geo through Disney Plus and Hulu, and look forward to hearing what everybody thinks about it.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you, and best of luck with the book.
Likewise, Douglas. Have a good one. Thank you.